Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome all to this month's edition of the Transylvania Lectures organized by the Matthias Corvinus Collegium. Our event aims to organize roundtable discussions for the local public where leading opinion makers debate current issues in international public discourse, which are relevant not only for our Transylvanian society, but for the whole world. I am Anna Bardos, a first-year university student specializing in international relations and European studies, and also a junior student at MCC. Please welcome today's speaker, Patrick G. Deneen, Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame in U.S.A. He is the author of several books, including Why Liberalism Failed, which has been translated into 20 languages, including Hungarian. He was a special advisor and speechwriter to the director of the United States Information Agency from 2005 to 2007. He has also taught at Princeton University and Georgetown University. On the other hand, please welcome today's moderator, Béla-Gergely, Assistant Professor of the Faculty of Economics and Business Administration at the Béla-Gergely University and lecturer at MCC. Today's lecture is searching for answers to whether the defining feature of modern politics is no longer traditional left and right, but a party of disruption and a party of stability. Professor Patrick G. Deneen proposes that both parties are essential for a flourishing political and human order, and that a renewal of the classical ideal of a mixed constitution is important to bridge the current self-destructive political divide. It is indeed a great honor and a pleasure to welcome you all. Let the lecture begin.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you, all of you, for coming on a beautiful spring day that I'm told is the most beautiful day you've had all spring so far. I'm grateful to MCC, Matthias Corvinus Collegium, for the invitation, and I'm especially grateful to Christina for organizing so much of our stay during this week. And I apologize that I'm coming to your country and to your university, to your college, speaking my language and not your language. So my apologies for that. But I try to learn some Hungarian, not yet Romanian, and it's not going to happen this year or any year. So I'm curious, just to start, my first night arriving, the day I arrived from the United States, overnight, no sleep. They forced me to go see a play downtown, Animal Farm by George Orwell. Have any of you seen this play? Somebody, let me see how many hands. Okay, so pretty good. So those of you who haven't seen the play, you should go see it if it's still playing, but maybe you know the story. The beginning of the story is the animals who've been ruled, dominated by the farmer, have a revolution. They overthrow the old regime, the ancien regime, the property owner, who treats them like animals. Well, they are animals, but he treats them like animals. And it's interesting because at the very beginning of this novel, this could be a story both about Russia or the Soviet Union, which it is really intended to be or is modeled on, but it could also have been a story in which the beginning was the United States, which also begins as a revolution by the animals. To overthrow the old aristocracy, or to put away the rule of the old king. Now, the main difference between the origin story of liberalism, the United States, and the origin story of Marxism, the Soviet Union, is not whether or not the people rise up to overthrow the old aristocracy. It's whether there will be a new ruling class. And Marxism taught us, or Marx taught us, that there would be no more ruling class. And in the famous line from Orwell's novel, all animals are equal, and they will always be equal. And of course, we know the story. If you saw the play, you know the story. By the end of the novel, they're not all equal. Some animals are more equal than others. Now, what's interesting about liberalism is liberalism doesn't begin with this fiction that everyone will be equal. It's actually a proposal that the old ruling class be replaced by a new ruling class. So it doesn't have this idea that we would all be equal. Now, there is a claim about equality. It's the equality of opportunity, the equality that would be everyone would begin the race of life from the same starting line. And they would all start when the gun sounds, and they would run and try to be successful, and the people who were faster would be more successful and would be more likely to achieve status and position and even influence in this new social order. But they wouldn't be the old aristocracy, because the old aristocracy never had to wait for the gun to go off in the starting line. They were simply going to be the ruling class just because their fathers were the ruling class and their families were the ruling class. So the liberal order, which I think is the order that is certainly the form of political ordering that demarcates, that defines the United States, proposes the replacement of an old aristocratic elite with a new kind of elite. And you see this articulated maybe for the first time in the arguments of the political philosopher John Locke, who lived from the year 1632 to 1704, and is well known for many works, but the work in particular that I would point to is his second treatise of government. And in particular, chapter 5 of the second treatise of government, which is a chapter that's titled On Property. And this for Locke is the key, in some ways, the key to what would become the new elite in this modern society, which is that property would no longer be what you inherited because you were born to a certain duke or a king or a prince or what you will. Property, rather, is something that every one of us owns. We all own property, he says, and the property we own is ourselves. This is our property. So we all start owning property, and then it's your job to do with your property the best you can. And by this he means become smart, become hardworking, become diligent, stay up and study late, don't go to too many parties. I've seen maybe some of you at the bars at night. Don't do too much of that. Work hard, be successful, and become influential and wealthy and powerful. And this will be the new form of property, but the property begins in me. This is the most important piece of property that I own. And therefore, the biggest investment that I make is developing this property. My mind, my talents, my ability. This is why many of you are in school, to do exactly this. So the proposal is not that the revolution to overthrow the old aristocracy will result in all the animals being equal. The proposal is that some will be more equal than others. Some will get more property. Some will be more successful. And so the first wave of this economic revolution, we could say, or this modern revolution, is a kind of economic revolution that John Locke and then later Adam Smith and other thinkers propose. And we could say that the hallmark or the feature of this new aristocracy is opposite to the hallmark or feature of the old aristocracy. The old aristocracy, its feature and its hallmark was order and stability and continuity, generational inheritance, one generation being a lot like the next generation, so that the grandchildren who would wake up and talk with their grandparents would be able to basically talk about a world that was very similar. Not like our world, where if you want to know what's happening in the world, the grandfather asks the grandchild, what's happening? How does this computer work? What is this internet? Right? In the world of the old aristocracy, if you walk around the city, you see a lot of evidence of this old world. It's about continuity and tradition. The hallmark of the new elite is, as John Locke writes, is to be industrious and rational. He says there are going to be two types of people primarily in this new order. The people who work hard, they're industrious, disciplined, hardworking, and the people, he says, who are quarrelsome and contentious and covetous. They covet, they're jealous. Right? These become modern-day Democrats in America, right? That's just a joke. These are the people who just want the other people's property. And this is, of course, a kind of a problem, which is there are going to be people who want the property in the old-fashioned way, which is just to kind of take it. But this is why protecting the rights of property is very important. Now, I was just curious to look at how the language we would use and the way in which we would describe our world itself changes. And I'm going to use English to do this. Are you familiar with one of the really neat pieces of modern technology called Google Ngram? Have any of you used this? This is really, it's really neat. I assume it exists in your languages. Google Ngram basically will search any publication that Google has scanned. So all the Google books that have been scanned, thousands, tens of thousands, 100,000s of books, you can plug in words or phrases, and it will tell you how often it was used, and it will trace its usage over time. And the two words I thought it would be interesting to look at was, the first of these is the word progress. This is the word progress, and notice this is 1700 on this end. Does this work? No. This is 1700 over here. 1700 to 2019 over here. So John Locke is right about 1688. So he's right about, 1688. So John Locke's right about here. That's very interesting how quickly the language, the word progress is used in English publications, English language publications. And notice how it, starting especially in the 19th century, you could say 19th century is defined, we could define the 19th century as the century of progress, the belief in progress. And progress not just in material terms, but also in moral terms, that we've become morally improved. And notice it stays pretty high until just after World War II, when we maybe start to have some doubts. Maybe things aren't going that well, but it still remains comparatively high. Now the word, I had to do a little bit of research on this, the word that represents the aristocratic age the most isn't order or stability, which I used in the lecture. It's actually preserve. This is the word that's used, this is the language of keeping or holding. It's the word it's the old-fashioned word for jam or jelly. My grandmother would call it preserves, because you keep the fruit, you keep it so it doesn't spoil. So it retains the quality of the thing. It retains it over time. So the word preserve is the word that was used more in the aristocratic age. And notice, as we would expect, here the same year, 1700 until 2020, you see this word going to be very common and then becoming less and less common over time. And what's neat with Google Ngram is you can combine these. And so look at this chart, it's really quite interesting. And notice how progress begins over here in the red. Almost nobody's talking about progress, before the 19th century, or at least midway through the 18th century. And then as the 18th century with John Locke and then Adam Smith later, and we move into the 19th and 20th century, even where progress is being less talked about here, it's still being much more talked about. And notice how preserve begins back in the 1700s as a much more invoked term. And they cross over here at about the time of John Locke's birth. It's interesting. Or at the time of John Locke's publication of the Second Treatise. So this is just one way, or one window into visibly seeing how a regime changes, how the basic fundamental assumptions of a regime changes. But I want to stress this because it strikes me that one of the features or qualities of the new ruling class that's being proposed by John Locke was that it would be a ruling class that would, in a sense, be revolutionary. The ruling class would be creating and constantly fostering, at first, a revolution in property, a constantly changing and transforming form of economy that we're all very used to, we're very accustomed to, but this was the aim, to have an economy, unlike the aristocratic time when you would seek to preserve society. This is an economy that's changing and transforming, and to use the language that tech bros, that Silicon Valley people, when their banks aren't failing, Silicon Valley people like to use, is disruptors. They want to be disruptors. And already from the 18th century and into the 19th century, disruption, progress is the key. Now, to visualize what we're seeing in some ways, I developed what political scientists love, which is a 4-quadrant box. Political scientists always love the 4-quadrant box because it's how to describe reality. And for this box, I thought it would be interesting to look at proposals over time for the people. I said resistant. Another way to describe it is the populists, the populi, the demos, that especially is seeks to resist this new ruling class, the people who are resistant to the transformative aspect of this form of property, or who dislike this new form of property. So we might describe them as revolutionary, but that's also a little confusing because I'm describing the elites as revolutionary. But what we could say is that for John Locke, who I'm going to put in category number 1 over here, classical liberalism, the elites are very worried about the way in which the people can be a threat to this new transformative form of economy. That they might become jealous, right? The very word that John Locke uses to describe the people who aren't going to be successful, the people who are not industrious, he uses covetous to describe them. They will covet the property and the success of those who are more successful. And so the people are potentially a kind of force of resistance to this sort of new, dynamic, disruptive world. And so one of the major developments, and the first developments of liberal philosophy in particular, is to develop a theory of constitutionalism, of how to restrain the demos from exercising too much political control, how to preserve rights of property, the central right, arguably, of the liberal age, the right to property. And if I were going to teach you a course on the American Constitution, which you don't want to take tonight, it would be really about the American Constitution is in many ways a constitution that appeals for its legitimacy to the people, but wants to limit how much they actually exercise control over the political and economic order. It's a kind of simultaneously enactment of popular will and a limitation of democratic power. And that's in many ways describes features of our Constitution. And I would describe this as the first wave or the first stage of liberalism, which especially focused on progress against the possibility of a destabilizing populace, but progress especially in material terms, in terms of economics. But there was a subsequent wave or a subsequent stage of liberalism which really worries less about the people as this kind of a populace that destabilizes progress or that is an obstacle to progress, and worries about the people as a kind of obstacle to social progress, social transformation. And here, the thinker I would really point us to is John Stuart Mill, not the most beautiful man ever to live, but a very important figure, an important thinker. And many of you might be familiar with his work on liberty. And On Liberty is really a kind of, it's like the sequel. You know, Marvel movies always have a sequel. Mill is the sequel to Iron Man. He's like Iron Man 4. Yeah. His book is the sequel to Locke, because Mill begins his book by saying, we got what Locke wanted. We have a society that's economically dynamic and that protects the rights of property owners, but we have still a very traditional society. He's writing in the 19th century. His book On Liberty is published in 1859. So one of the trips I took was to, I have to get this right, Toroczko, is that what it was? Toroczko St. Georgi, right? That was a traditional society, right? That was a very traditional, and many of you have said you come from villages that are very traditional, so I don't have to describe this to you. In other words, where even if you live in a liberal capitalist society, it's still a very traditional society. And even if you are legally free to do certain things, it's not what you do. You grow up understanding you don't act certain ways. The neighbors will talk. You know the neighbor next door who always talks about us, that we don't want to have her spreading gossip about us. That Mill is really worried about a very traditional society which exists in England in 1850s. And he speaks now not of political despotism so much as cultural despotism. In fact, he uses the phrase, the despotism of culture, or the despotism of custom, the despotism of tradition. And this is more difficult, Mill recognizes, because you can be politically free to do lots of things. But in a traditional society, you're sort of hemmed in, you're controlled by opinion. And that's harder to legislate. It's harder to legislate opinion. It's harder to say, stop being traditional. Mill worries, and what he calls tyranny of the majority, a phrase that's quite famous and often we associate it with Tocqueville, but Mill was also someone very concerned about the tyranny of the majority. He says the real tyranny of the majority he describes as a social tyranny that is more formidable, that's more intimidating, because it penetrates more deeply into the details of life. It penetrates into our very psyche. We internalize these opinions, and it's hard for us to get outside of them. So you start to be a traditional person, not because you thought of those traditions, not because you invented them, not because you chose them, but simply because they were passed on and you were told, this is how we are, this is what we do. So it's a deep internalization of this idea of social tyranny. In his work on liberty, his real call is not necessarily so much for political liberty as it is for social liberty, for the freedom from the opinion of others. And he said, only if those who wish to live what he calls experiments in living, to live differently, to be unique. His favorite word is individuality. To do what they want to do because they have chosen it. Only such a world, he says, is one in which we can be genuinely free, in which we can enjoy liberty. The title of the book. Now, to do this, he argues, we have to change society. It's not just the politics. Society has to change. And it has to be changed in a way where custom and tradition no longer govern, in which it's constantly possible for all of us to live experiments in living. And this means a society that becomes hostile to and seeks to begin to deconstruct custom and tradition and the old ways of doing things. Now, Mill recognizes this is going to be difficult because you have these conservative people. And if you're a democracy, how do you do this? Well, among the things Mill proposes is that we should have forms of voting that make sure that smart people and more progressive people are going to have more votes. So he says if you have a college education, you're going to get more votes than people who don't have a college education. So we've got that, right? I get like 50 votes because I have a doctorate. You might get 10 votes, maybe 4. But the really dumb people, the backward people, they only get 1 vote. So we make sure they're not running the place. But more importantly, notice what Mill is arguing, is that the traditional or old ways of doing things and the institutions that perpetuated those have to become undone. And this means institutions like the churches, family, community, culture, custom, practices, traditions, and inheritances. This is a revolutionary philosophy, not just in economic terms, but as a social system. And for those of you who've been watching what's happening in the world today, I think it's fair to say we live in a world that's philosophically shaped by John Stuart Mill, where every time we think, okay, some settled view of what it is to be a man or a woman, or what marriage is, or what children are, or what we should expect from these relationships, these are constantly being challenged and overturned, precisely because we need to overturn the idea that there's supposed to be a way or a proper way of doing these things. And thus we can live experiments in living. Now, just as an aside, what's kind of interesting, might be interesting to you, this divide between the classical liberal, between the classical liberal and the progressive liberal, this defines the political divide between the American political parties for the last 50 years. Any of you who are trying to figure out American politics, this is it. It's the Lockeans against the Millians, or it was. This was kind of Ronald Reagan, and this was Barack Obama over here. This is the classical liberal, what we in America call conservative, but it's actually liberal, against the progressive liberals. And what the conservatives would say, or what the classical liberals would say, is we want free markets and we want traditional society. And what the progressives said is we want more social markets, but we want radically free, autonomous individuals, and we want to loosen society and make society more radically free. So maybe that's a little bit helpful for you when you think about the insanity of American politics. This maybe helps you understand this a little better. Now, since I'm in Romania, it's worth also mentioning the name of Karl Marx, because Marx is a response to these. And what Marx's response is that there is a revolutionary party. It's not the elites, it's the people. The people are the revolutionary party, and they will overthrow these guys. Right? The Marxists will overthrow these guys over here. That the true revolutionary party will revolt and rise up against the bourgeoisie, will overturn capitalism, and that they will usher in a new world. And that this new world would be a world that, interestingly, among other things, overturned all of the old traditional institutions of aristocratic society that John Stuart Mill didn't like. So there's a way in which Marx and Mill have a little bit in common in this sense. That what Marx and Engels and Lenin envision isn't just an equal economic society, but one in which the old institutions are also undone. The family, religion, associations, the nation, right? The state, right? Eventually the withering away of the state and of the nation and of borders, until we achieve what he called species being. We would transcend all of our particularities and become one with the species being. It's like 1960s meets John Lennon's Imagine. It's a dream of a kind of utopia. Now here's the irony. If the 20th and 21st century, I would submit, have proven anything, it's that the revolutionary elite proposed first by Locke and then added to by Mill has been much more successful in achieving these ends that Marx had proposed. Marx's proposal of doing away with or beginning to weaken the family, maybe even eliminating the family, of doing away with religion, of making religion irrelevant, of undoing the idea of being a member of a nation as opposed to, say, a European Union or a global community. This, the last 50 years, has proven much more successful at this than Marx could have ever conceived. And it did it without forcing people to do it. It did it through choice. In other words, making a world in which we would choose, or at least we think we're choosing, to abandon all of these things. Right? What was more successful in killing Catholicism in Poland, which is not dead yet, but it's declining? Was it communism, or has it been liberalism? And it's certainly the case that a lot fewer people are attending church, even secret churches under communism, today under liberalism, than was the case under communism. And it's probably true in other countries that we could think of as well. So we have a kind of, I would suggest, a kind of combination of two parties at the top here who are the parties of disruption and of revolution. They are led by elites who, whether in the economic realm or in the social realm, seek constant transformation and upheaval and revolution. And they benefit quite extensively by this revolution. And this is the really key point, and here I'll conclude. The party of disruption is a new ruling class that benefits from its disruption. They benefit economically. They benefit disproportionately economically. And they are the new wealth class, certainly of the West and of the broader world. They benefit from a constant churning and disruptive economic system in which more and more of the wealth of the world goes into fewer hands. We have increasingly, certainly in the United States, a two-tiered society of economic winners and economic losers. And the losers aren't just losing economically, they're also losing socially, because the institutions that might once have made it possible to live a flourishing life, even if you're not an economic winner, are also degrading. They're also being undone. For the first time in American history, since this has been measured, the life expectancy rate has declined. It has declined. And it has declined because of what are called deaths of despair. Deaths of despair, deaths in which you are medicating yourself or committing suicide or taking drugs or alcohol. What we have seen in the last few years is a revolution, and it's a revolution against the revolutionaries. And this is my last quadrant. And it's a revolution of, we could say, the populists or a certain kind of conservatism. I use this word conservatism with hesitation, but I appeal here to a figure like Edmund Burke, Disraeli, or in the American tradition, the critics of the Constitution. But I'll focus on Edmund Burke. In other words, this is the assumption that both the people are conservative, and in some ways, the people's view, which is more conservative, should rule, should be the governing way in which one approaches the world. And it's remarkable that in the Western world today, and in particular in the societies most influenced by this tradition, by the Locke and Mill tradition, which is the United States and Great Britain. In the year 2016, the same year, you had two cataclysmic, political earthquakes that occurred. You had Brexit, the vote for Brexit, which was, again, mostly working class people who voted that England, Great Britain should leave the European Union, should assume its tradition of being a self-standing nation state and preserve British traditions and a British way of life, very kind of the idea of preserving, the idea of preserving something that we want to maintain and continue to be. And in the United States, of course, you had the election of Donald Trump. And whatever you think of Donald Trump, I'm not here to say Donald Trump was good or bad, but what was true is that it was a kind of unplanned and unorganized movement from below to say, we no longer like these particular set of elites. We don't like what they're doing to us economically. We don't want to have all of our jobs sent overseas and all of our factories sent overseas, and we don't want to have borders that are porous, in which our jobs are being threatened by people who can work for less money than us, and we don't like the social transformation of our world. So it was a reaction against both of these kinds of liberalism. In a sense, then, what we are seeing, or what I'm suggesting we're seeing, is a kind of revolution against the revolutionaries. And that's a bit of a paradox. But nevertheless, I think this is in some ways helps to explain some of what we've been seeing in our political world. And in some ways, I think the question, and this gets to the title that was read and the description that was read, is whether, the question right now, is whether the consolidated parties of the liberal tradition will be able to combine, as they are attempting to do right now, to put down this new revolution, this effort to, from below, assert a kind of party of order against the party of revolution. And this is, I think, it's not just a theoretical question. This is in some ways going to be the defining feature of American politics, and probably a lot more than American politics for the coming years. And what it certainly does is it changes American politics from a battle between these two traditions to a battle between this tradition and mostly this tradition, although I would keep an eye on this as well, because if they get a chance, they'll try to come back. But okay, I don't have to tell you that. Okay, so let me stop and we can have a conversation. Thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you for your presentation, and I have to say that, however, I agree with most of what you have said and what you have presented, and of course what you have written in the past years. On one hand, I think that agreeing is less productive and not engaging. On the other hand, I have to say that I'm an economist. I teach economics. I teach neoclassical economics. So if you wish, I'm a liberal economics. So I suggest that we will have an interesting conversation about the economic rule and about what had happened with the society in the past few decades. And for introduction, I would like to start with a provocative statement that this is not a safe space. So if you are afraid that your beliefs, your thoughts, your ideologies will be questioned, then they will be. So at least this is what we hope. And I will start with the economical order which you were talking about. And my question is that, of course, we see that these elites and this liberal economy and the order of the economic order resulted in something that we won't say that this is what we wanted or what we expected. It's something else, and of course it has a lot of problems and issues. But my question is about human nature, because if we think that, of course, there are some conservative values, there are things that we want, there are things what we value, and there is what we do. And I see a gap in there that who we are and what we do, it is different what we value and what we want. And two things here, just that I teach, as I said, I teach economics, and I always say, perhaps I'm mistaken, but what I say is that what I teach and what the economic order is about is not that we do what I teach and what my colleagues teach, but I teach what we do. So basically what we do, and the economical order, as I see it, it's just facing a mirror to us. And what we see, and of course we have issues with what we see, is basically who we are. And of course there are some discrepancies there, because perhaps we value other things. And one last thing, and then please, then we can have a conversation. Is you mentioned Torocko, for example, and I think Torocko is a really good example. But what I see in Torocko, for example, is that it appears as a conservative village, but I think that's the facade, because and I have this problem with traditional conservatism, because it has a facade of showing something and which perhaps it is not. Right. And for example, Torocko,
I wasn't claiming it was what it's making money off of what it appears to be.
Yes, and they are making money of it. So this is my first group of my questions.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's interesting. What you just heard is a version of an argument that John Locke made, or that Adam Smith made many years ago. So I'm glad to see that the classical liberal economists and thinkers are not leaving the script. They are still giving the same message. And the message is the following: that look at what we do, not at what we say we do. Look at what we actually do. And what we actually do is that we act out of our interest. We act, to use the language of microeconomics, we maximize our utility. We seek to maximize our advantage and our benefits. And we can do that in lots of different ways, but this is the core of really what we are. This is the foundational claim of the liberal tradition. I'm going to tell you not what you ought to be. I'm going to tell you what you are. And once we determine what you are, we can develop a political system, we can develop an economic system, we can develop a legal system that doesn't presume that you're something different than what you actually are. So for example, the US Constitution is written with the idea that human beings are basically ambitious and greedy, and not that people are good and self-sacrificing. So you want to have checks and balances. You want to make sure that no one can become dominant. You want to create the ways in which ambition will counteract ambition. And this is the basic design. It kind of derives from the classical liberal assumption. But here's the tricky thing, and I often ask my students this: is this what you really think you are? Maybe it is. Is everything you do for self-maximization? Is everything you do out of self-interest? Do you think Mother Teresa was being basically self-interested? Is there nothing in you that's other than utility maximization? And here, I think, if you have a suspicion that maybe that's not everything that you are, I want to say you're right. Maybe it's not all of you. Maybe it's just one of you. And I want to be your friend if it's just one of you. Because I don't want to be the other people's friends. Right. Because here's really interesting, I'll use a little bit of data. A study of the economics discipline. And there were several social scientists who undertook a study of social science, and in particular, or social scientific study of economics. And they examined the views of students who majored in economics. And they measured them in two different ways. They measured them first across time. So when they would begin their study of economics and when they would finish their study of economics. And they examined them also in comparison to other students who were majoring or studying other fields. And they discovered the following, that students, when they began their course in economics, were more likely to be charitable, were likely to express views about self-sacrifice, were likely to be more solidaristic in their thinking. And as they went through the course of study, they became more self-interested. They defined their actions as motivated by self-interest and utility maximization. In other words, I think what we really need to see is that classical liberalism isn't really a description of what we are. It's teaching us. It teaches us how we should think of ourselves, how we should think of who we are fundamentally, and how we should think of other people and the ways that they basically want to take advantage of us if we don't protect ourselves. And once you make that a set of assumptions, it changes and fundamentally transforms how you see the world. So this is important because in many ways the alternative that I would in some ways want to point us to out beyond the classical liberal tradition is a tradition. It's my own faith tradition. I'm a Catholic, Irish Catholic. I am a fan of Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas. And this tradition teaches us that yes, we're sinful, we're self-interested. I mean, look at Adam and Eve. Look at the evidence of humanity. There's a lot of self-interest. But we're also capable and have the possibility of being saint-like or Christ-like or virtuous. But if we live in a world that doesn't cultivate that part of us, that doesn't exercise those muscles of what it is to be a person who is virtuous and self-other-regarding, as it is the case often with students who study only economics, then we are going to make the world into that form. We're going to make the world into that form. So I guess I would just suggest that one of the ways that liberalism in some ways has been successful is to pretend it's telling us what we really are. And I'm not saying this is what you're doing, but it's to pretend to tell us what we really are, while in fact deeply and subtly teaching us what it thinks we should be and how it is in fact we should act. So that's just one response to that first part. I have thoughts about Taraschko, but go ahead. You have more to say.
Yeah, that might be true, absolutely, because well, it's a model and it's simplifying what's happening in the world. But I hope that I'm not doing that.
You're part of the system.
Yes, I'm part of it. Yeah, absolutely. But even Adam Smith states that nothing what he writes and what he thinks doesn't work with a moral foundation. So even he is talking about moral foundation, and of course. Pursuing self-interest is something that we are talking about and what we teach and how the world, from our perspective, works. But pursuing self-interest results or becomes to public interest for many times or in many cases. And of course, the state, for example, is there for redistribution rules. So the state also has, in the liberal states, also have this role of yes, achieving the highest performance, and then really important role of redistribution. And if we look, for example, the European model or the Scandinavian model of liberalism and liberal democracies and even liberal economies, we see that they have a higher level of redistribution than, for example, in China, where the Communist Party rules the country. So they have basically a higher solidarity than other countries, where they say they are not working on or they are not in a liberal democracy and in a liberal economy. So I think this is also interesting that how we think about the role of the state as, of course, achieving the highest performance and the redistribution and the solidarity, which is basically provided by the state in many times.
Well, that puts a lot of burden on the state, obviously, and on the public sector. The word liberal, and we could talk about this forever, but the word liberal is, of course, it's complex and it means many things. And I've used it to describe one key aspect of liberalism that I think is especially recognizable to Americans, which is the idea of autonomy, of individual freedom. And that that's me. Individual liberty is the goal, in many ways, of our political order, right? So the thing you describe as the thing that provides solidarity, at least in the American mindset, is the thing that's supposed to secure and advance individual liberty. So you'll never get, it's just, you just really don't run into, politicians, they'll say things like we want to be more of a community or a national family or a national community, but the real promise is you will be able to, I will make sure that you can be more free than ever. More free of other people, more free of anything that might constrain your individual liberty. And it's really a matter of emphasis, whether it's economic liberty or social liberty. And that tends to be the divide in the mainstream of American parties today. But I think when you think of what you describe as European liberalism, in some ways, it's really not quite that. It has, as you point out, places like Sweden, but we don't have to look that far away, right? We can look at, Germany has more sort of social democracy, social network, a social net. Most European countries do. And I think you probably regard Americans as a bit crazy, because why don't you have a healthcare system that can take care of people and doesn't throw people out onto the streets? I think this is, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, I think this is a legacy of an older tradition. And I wouldn't even call it liberal. I would call it a kind of what used to be called Christian democracy. These institutions were founded after World War II by people like Konrad Adenauer and equivalents around Europe. These had a deep penetration in the sort of self-understanding that we are not fundamentally individual autonomous units, which is the assumption of the kind of Lockean tradition. Right? What is our nature? Our nature is to be free and equal in the state of nature. That's what we are by nature. In this older tradition, which has its roots all the way back into the classical tradition, articulated by Aristotle, human beings are by nature social and political animals. Social and political animals, as Aquinas says. I think this sort of, even without having to study philosophy, this is something that is kind of in the European understanding of what it is to be a human being, that we are by nature social and political animals. Now, the state has one important role. The government has one important role to play in that, but it's not the only player in that, of course. And it can't be the only. If it becomes the only player in that, then we're in trouble, right? It's an important player, but a good society that's solidaristic has kind of, you could say, amplifies this social nature of human beings in the many forms of interrelated and interconnected ways of life that we share. And again, it begins at the level of the family. It includes the kind of community that we live in. It includes the friendships that we build, the more extensive bonds that we build. It includes things like universities and the kind of communities that universities are, and all the various forms of human institutions and organizations that we have as human beings. Now here's the problem in some ways with, I think it's captured by your formulation, not intentionally, which is that societies increasingly in Europe have adopted a kind of social liberalism and a kind of economic form of solidarity. And the problem increasingly becomes the social liberalism actually begins to undermine the actual conditions of solidarity. So the government is expected to do a lot of things, but we increasingly are going to live lives as autonomous individuals. So Europe, ironically, is becoming more liberal. And here I would say America might be exerting a bad influence in this regard. American culture, you watch too much American movies, stop that. It's not good for you. It's not good for your soul. This ideal of living this free life, disconnected and autonomous, it begins to work its way into European society as well. And notice what one of the major crises of European society is. You can't reproduce yourselves. You don't form families, you don't have children. Not saying you, maybe you. You are increasingly living lives that are not generationally connected. And this is becoming, of course, a major political problem and issue in Europe, which is, well, what do you have to do? Well, you have to bring in people from other cultures and other civilizations, and they will do the work. And now Sweden is experiencing some significant problems on this front, as is nearly every European country today. So in some ways, the more liberal you're going to become, if we're going to use Sweden as an example, the less likely you're going to have that form of solidarity. Because now you're having this form of kind of tension within the culture, right, between the people who now have to come in, immigrant communities and so forth. So a lot of the solidarity in some ways comes from the deeper part of the tradition and not just from the state. And I think we make a mistake if we think we can just have solidarity by the government acting in some ways and not understand that it has a deeper foundation.
Mm-hmm. I see. I think it was really interesting your 2x2 matrix that you have showed, and it was absolutely interesting. Well, what you were saying is that basically the classical liberalism didn't work, and then came the populists who had another offering, and they are pretending. Well,
I guess can I say I think classical liberalism in fact may have worked too well.
Or maybe, yes, exactly. And then another elite is writing, and they say, for example, with the election of Trump 5-6 years ago, that they say that they come from above, they are not part of an elite. And if we look at them, they basically are. Mm-hmm. But it's another kind of elite. And I think with a few questions or a few sentences, how do you think the new elites form? And are these new elites a better version of what we had?
I think the Trump years were really instructive in lots of ways. Because, in fact, I don't think that there is a new elite that represents the kind of populist position. If we think about the elite institutions, of course, we could think about them in Europe, and we can think about them in the United States. What would these institutions be? They would be, of course, universities, media, the people who are influential in popular culture, Hollywood, movie making, music industry, bureaucracy. Think about all the institutions that kind of run society. They're all run basically by progressives, some form of liberal, who pretty much hate populism. And during the Trump years, the media, the universities, every one of these institutions spent almost the entire 4 years, and it was actually more like 5 years because the campaign was a year before, spent the entire 5 years, and now continue not analyzing, not investigating, not asking questions, denouncing, condemning, absolutely, regarding as completely unacceptable the election of Donald Trump. Now, I'm not going to say that there's not good reason to do that, but what I am going to say is that there was no sort of reflection, self-reflection on why did this happen? What led to this really kind of cataclysmic, unusual, unpredictable electoral event? In other words, there was no elite segment of the society that was prepared to work on behalf of what Donald Trump in some ways represented. The entire American elite, you could say, is formed to work for either classical liberalism or progressive liberalism. That's what it's formed to do. And I always I ask my students at the beginning of classes, are you a conservative or are you a liberal? And this is what they almost always say. They say, well, I'm an economic conservative, but I'm a social liberal. Now, if you think about what I put up there, what they're saying is, I'm a Lockean and a Millian. They think they're being really interesting and complex. Oh, I'm so interesting. I'm economically conservative, which means they're liberal. And I'm socially liberal, which means they're liberal. Because if you're going to be a member of the elite in American society, I teach at very prestigious, you heard about my prestigious appointments, Princeton and Georgetown and Notre Dame, very high ranked school. If you're going to be a member of the class that you want to join or be a part of, you have to be a good liberal. You have to be a liberal in good standing. You can't be a populist. That would be not very fashionable. So I actually think what happened was you had this election of this figure who couldn't form his own elite cadre, who could the American government's big, it's got a lot of positions, a lot of people need to run it. There were very few people who were prepared to run that government, and many of them came from previous administrations of basically classical liberals or various form neoconservatives. I mean, John Bolton running the national security. I mean, this guy, he wants to go to war with everyone. And Trump said he didn't want to have wars all the time, so this is not the right person to appoint. So this is to say that part of, I think, what we're seeing now in anticipation of a realignment of American politics. And I'm actually flying to London in 2 weeks to talk to about 20 members of parliament who want to see a realignment of British politics. So these are Tories who are afraid that they are losing the advantage they now have with the, what are they called there? The blue districts. So we call them red, they call them blue. These are the former Labour districts that voted for Tory, for Boris Johnson. And they're beginning to lose their support, and they actually want to reorganize the Tory party so that they can retain the political support of the Tories. And what they really want to begin thinking about is how do we create a ruling ideology that can reflect this new alignment that potentially combines a set of elites. It's going to have to be elites. You're going to have people who run things, and a kind of popular support. But it's going to be elites who are going to be, in some ways, to use the old Marxist phrase, they're going to be class traitors. Right? They're going to have to, in some ways, be oppositional to their own class, to the institutions that formed them and from which they come. And I'm pretty interested in being a class traitor, I have to say, myself. But we'll see how that goes.
I will have a last question, and then
sure.
I will ask the audience to ask their questions. Is back to the populists and the elites. And I think it's really interesting how elites formed and how elites are forming, because you were talking about aristocracy, which basically was given. I mean, you were born there or not. So there was no entrance, and that was it. And then we switched. I think this is something which came with liberalism, that we switched aristocracy to meritocracy, and then it says, as you mentioned, that if you work hard, you can get to the elites. And now even meritocracy is changing, because, and I thought that I won't say that we have met before and we have been talking about some issues.
I told you not to say
yes. But now meritocracy is also changing, because we have a lot of positive discrimination, and I think this is also really interesting how these elites formed, or how these elites were in the past, and how were they like 50 years ago, and how are they forming now. I think this is interesting, and then the audience will have the possibility to ask their questions.
Yeah, so I mean, there are two aspects of meritocracy that become really problematic. So I guess I would say there's probably no political order and no political system that doesn't have problems, and it generates more and more problems that it can't solve. So that in the introduction, I have a new book coming out called Regime Change, and I suggest we need to revisit the ancient idea of mixed constitution, and how do you mix the positive features, especially that are characteristic of elites, and the positive characteristics that are characteristic of the demos. But what we have seen, I mean, I think it's fair to say that the old aristocracy generated problems and injustices that it was not able to solve. And the gap between what it said it was doing and what it was doing became too large. And they lost legitimacy. What it said it was doing was ruling out of noblesse oblige, to use the French, caring for the poorer people and for the peasants, and being good stewards and rulers and just and acting based on justice. But of course, as all of our stories tell us now, they were actually doing the opposite. They were acting on their own interest and on their own behalf. This is where look at what they were doing and not what they were saying. And in some ways you could say that we have a similar situation today in two ways. The first is that meritocrats, so-called, the people who excel in this modern, dynamic, revolutionary world, that they do benefit themselves, but their argument and their justification has been everything they do also benefits all of us. So even if there's inequality, in particular economic inequality, I'm going to make an argument that you'll hear in every microeconomics class, maybe macroeconomics, that the overall prosperity of society increases. And so even if you're a relatively poor person in a successful capitalist economy, you're doing very well, right? I mean, the king didn't, the kings of old, the old aristocrats they didn't even have good toilets, not to mention cell phones and flat screen TVs and automobiles and airplanes, right? You ever try to live in an old castle? It's cold all the time. Right? Nice little apartment is nicer than that today than living in an old castle. So even if you're a poor person in such a society, you're better off. And this has been the argument. But in more recent years, I would suggest, this argument begins to become it carries less force because the gap, the distance between the very wealthy and successful and those who are less successful has grown so extensive, especially in places like the United States, that it's not just, I don't get satisfaction by pulling out my cell phone. I feel a deep sense of insult, a sense of indignity, and especially because things that should not be so hard, like going to a doctor or going to college, are incredibly difficult if you're not well off in the United States. And how am I going to comfort myself by saying at least I can watch a flat screen TV, and that's supposed to comfort me? Right? So there's a deep sense of indignity now that is especially pervasive among those who are not the economic winners. At the same time, over time, people who win in meritocracy come to view their station as deserved. They earned it. They were successful because they were industrious and rational, as Locke says. They worked hard. And if you're not successful, that's your fault. So any sense of noblesse oblige that maybe or maybe not was part of the old aristocracy disappears. You deserve your station. Too bad for you. Just work harder. In the years leading up to 2016, there were many authors and many writers, these are both classical liberals and progressive liberals, who were basically saying, if you're not being economically successful, you need to move. You need to go where there's good jobs. You need to be retrained. You need to catch up. And if you don't do that, you deserve your fate. You deserve what you get. So it's your fault. That's the first, I think, meritocracy begins to lose its legitimacy. And there's a second thing, which is it turns out that it's a lot like the old aristocracy. You start to inherit your position. And this is something that we've noticed now over the last few generations. It turns out if you're going to go to Harvard or Yale or Princeton or Stanford, and these are the places where you get to be a member of the meritocracy, it really helps if your parents went to Harvard or Yale or Princeton. And it really helps too because your parents can influence the decision. And if you paid attention to what happened recently, some of these famous actresses, maybe not that famous, they were caught bribing coaches to tell the university that their beautiful, wonderful daughter or children were great volleyball players or fencers. They didn't know what a volleyball was. They never picked up a sword in their life. But that there was a way in which the system could be manipulated. Now, this was illegal and they got arrested and went to prison. But there's a lot you can do to give your children advantages that's just on the other side of illegality. You can do a lot of things that are legal, like what I'm doing with my daughter. I took my daughter here. So now when she applies to graduate school, she can say, I visited Cluj. I visited Kosovo. I visited I've been to all these places, and now aren't I wonderful? So of course I want to give my daughter advantages. What parent doesn't want to give their children advantages? But it becomes a kind of new aristocracy, and this is also offends the dignity of those who are not successful. So meritocracy now is becoming increasingly illegitimate in the eyes of those who are not winners in the system, and I think this is also feeding this populist energy. So it's an interesting subject that, yeah, much worth of discussion.
Thank you. And if we have questions from the audience, I was told that you should ask your questions on Menti. You have some papers on your seats, and there are Menti codes. But if you are not comfortable using technology, I will allow you to ask questions by raising your hand and asking. We have the microphone, so you will have the possibility. And one more thing, if you are not comfortable to ask your questions in English, you can ask it in Hungarian, and then I will translate it, okay? So that shouldn't be a problem. Please. I'm looking at Menti. There is no, there are no questions.
We've answered all that. You probably should have said that before.
Well, the first question, do you think that freedom is more important than caring? As a European audience, it's hard to see why the Americans want so desperately a society where we leave people behind.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I hope you have understood that I'm not a great fan of the American British liberal tradition. I wrote a book which was mentioned. I can't say it in Hungarian, but it is translated in Hungarian, called Why Liberalism Failed. And the thesis of the book, as I expressed here today, is that liberalism has failed because liberalism succeeded. It's set out to make us, and primarily I was speaking about America, but I think it's a problem throughout the Western world and maybe the broader world, to make us into autonomous individual selves who believe ourselves to be free of other human beings and free of the kind of obligations and duties that we have to other human beings. And it's done this primarily in two ways, as I've mentioned, through a kind of economic and social liberation. It's kind of a combination of Locke and Mill, and it's continuing, but also, of course, through technological and the development of technologies that not just when I say technology, everyone thinks cell phones, but I think of more things like the automobile and the way that we use the automobile in the United States, which is to drive always to make sure we are away from other people. We don't want to live like you Europeans so close together. You can hear the neighbor through the walls. We want to have our own gigantic homes where we have surrounded by lawns that we have to mow and use a lot of gas to cut our beautiful lawns. I think this is it's a crazy way to organize a human life, and it's an unsustainable way, not just environmentally but also socially, to form a human life. So I'm not proposing that freedom is not important. I think it is important. Of course I do. But I think that what we have, in particular in the liberal tradition forgets or obscures that the word liberty in its original meaning means self-rule. It means the capacity to be self-governing. And to be self-governing is someone who understands that simply to do as you wish is a form of slavery. This is the argument of Plato, and this is the argument of St. Paul in the Bible, right? From sin set free, right? To be a slave to sin or to be free in Christ. This is the genuine meaning of freedom, is to be free of the self-interested part of our nature in some ways, to be free from that which drives us most elementally and instinctively. And if you don't have the kind of institutions in society that help to teach us this, right, which begins with the family, and it extends out from families, neighborhoods, communities, all of the institutions like churches and universities that help to shape us as social and political animals, then you end up with, I think, a society of fragmentation and loneliness where you have rising deaths of despair. This book that I've written that's coming out in June is the effort to answer the question I have gotten every time I've talked about this book. Okay, you don't like liberalism, then what should we have? And the effort to answer that question is to say what we really should have is a society that is one that is deeply informed by this ethic of care and commitment and duty and obligation. But this means you have to, in some ways, push back against both sides of liberalism. Now, this might seem obvious to you, your European audience, but in America today, the choice has been, which liberalism are you on the side of? Are you on the side of economic liberalism, or are you on the side of social liberalism? And I'm afraid you have to care about these questions because, as the old saying goes, when America sneezes, the world catches a cold. So you have to care, I'm sorry, about what our problems are, because it becomes the world's problems. Yeah, maybe it won't always be this way. I think it will not always be this way, but right now it is. So I think unless we, as a nation, and perhaps with your help, address this particular illness, I'm afraid we'll make the world more ill in this regard.
Mm-hmm. So basically the alternative for what is in the USA and what doesn't work, obviously, is what we have in Europe.
I would say that we can learn things. You know, I don't think you can import an entire civilization from one civilization to the next. And the United States has its own conditions that are going to make certain things not plausible. But I think we have some things to learn. I also, and this is where I run into maybe the most problem, is that my critics on both the Locke side and on the Mill side, their favorite argument against me is that I'm an anti-American. If I don't like liberalism, I must hate America. Because they equate America with liberalism. That's what America is. To be a good American, to be a loyal citizen, is to be a citizen who's loyal to this ideology. And my argument is that there's actually traditions within the American tradition that we can draw on, but that we may be forgotten or suppressed. And these are what I want to help draw out. And one of these traditions, actually a very old tradition in America, is a kind of populist tradition. And populism didn't begin, 3 years ago in the United States. It goes way back. It goes when I mentioned the words anti-federalist. These were the original opponents to our Constitution. And why did they oppose the Constitution? They were too afraid it was not going to create solidarity, that it was too based on interest, that it assumed the worst of human beings, that it assumed we're self-interested, and the Constitution was about creating checks and balances. And they wanted a system that would be more solidaristic. So we don't even have to say that we just have to look to Europe. We can benefit from looking to Europe, but we have our own tradition that we need to better understand. So I resist the label anti-American. Sometimes I feel that, but turn the video off for that. But I think we have traditions that we can draw on that we need to bring to the surface.
However, we had populists earlier than the United States, I think. So basically, what the United States learned from Europe is populism, perhaps.
I think
because we have a few.
There's a native version of it to the United States
yes.
as well.
Okay, I see. I will read one question from here. Do you think that liberals and conservatives need each other? Could they even exist without each other?
So, like the word liberal, the word conservative, of course, is a complicated word. But I'll give it one definition. You can accept this. You don't have to. I mean, you can or you don't have to accept this definition. But my definition of conservative would be, and the word is problematic because. Let me start here. The word conservative tends to be a position that's relative to something else that's happening. So what is it that you're conserving? What is it that you're preserving? And it's always going to be whatever it was that was at some point in the past that you think is worth preserving. But of course, that was probably yesterday's revolution. What you're trying to preserve was something that may have been transformed last year or 10 years ago. So the conservative in some ways is always trailing the revolution. So maybe I was told yesterday, I was interviewed by a Romanian journalist, and he told me, I don't know if this is true, he told me that people who call themselves conservatives today in Romania are often ex-Marxists. I don't know if that's true, but this makes sense, of course, because what Marxists are trying to conserve is the past, which in the most immediate past was Marxism, right? So this would make sense. So I would prefer to give a substantive definition to this label, and it doesn't have to be called conservative. Or we could call it, for the purposes of this book, I'm calling it common good conservatism. And I think its fundamental feature, I would say it's several fundamental features. First, it is not an ideology of progress. All three of the ideologies that I showed you are all ideologies of progress. Lockean liberalism is material progress. Millian liberalism is social progress. Of course, Marxism is revolutionary progress to the perfection of humankind. And the fourth category rejects progress as the fundamental object or goal of its ideology. Now, it doesn't resist the idea of change and reform, but my mention of Edmund Burke points to a philosophy that sees the necessity of change that's generally organic and bottom-up. It comes organically and from the bottom up, and it tends to be more gradual. It tends to take place over generations, as opposed to a kind of society that's constantly churning and disrupting. The second feature would be a concern for the common good. And I think if liberalism is defined especially by the effort to liberate the individual from the obligations of others, what I would describe as, or what I would want to label as conservative would be a concern for the common good. That is to say, what are especially the institutions, this echoes what I said earlier, what are the institutions that teach us how to behave and act on behalf of the common good? It's like being a healthy person. To be a healthy person, you can be a healthy person for a little while, and you young people are enjoying it right now, but if you don't do certain things to make sure you remain healthy, eating well, exercising, taking care of yourself, getting good night's sleep, all of these good things, you won't stay healthy. And to be someone who is concerned for the common good is, in a way, requires the same kind of work in the world of our social and political world. It needs exercise. It needs the work of the muscles of the common good. And in order to achieve that, you actually need to be in some ways surrounded by the institutions that help to foster that. And they need to be very local, as well as national and possibly even global. They need to run through the entire order. They can't just be the state. It can't be the global state, the world state. And of course, it can't just be the community, because the community can be too small. You need something bigger than the community. I'm just articulating Catholic social teaching right now. This is called subsidiarity, solidarity and subsidiarity. But this is for me the essence of what I would want to. The label conservative is not that important to me, but I use it because it's somewhat recognizable as an alternative to liberal.
Okay, we want one more question. We have a lot of questions, and I'm really happy about it, and we could continue this. Yeah. But one last question: how would you describe the Orbán regime from Hungary? Well, they declaratively are not liberal, or they say they are illiberal from one perspective. How do they succeed from your perspective in not being liberal or offering an
Maybe
alternative?
I do have to turn off the cameras now. I'm not an expert on Hungarian politics. Like many American conservatives, I'm very interested in what's happening in Hungary, because it does seem to provide something of a model, and it's a model that, again, I would be the first to recognize it doesn't translate, you can't just take it and move it into an American context. But it provides something of a model for thinking about how especially the political order can be oriented to this idea of the common good as I'm describing it. Now, of course, it broke the brains of the American intellectual class when Viktor Orbán called Hungary an illiberal democracy, famously in a speech that he gave. And in some ways, I regret this word illiberal, because it makes liberal the standard. If you're not liberal, you're illiberal. And I just don't like making liberal the standard, because it suggests it's a deviation from the norm. Whereas I would like to say, let's make liberalism the deviation from the norm. Let's have people who have to declare themselves to be an ill-conservative Democrat or something. So it acknowledges too much kind of assumption of what the norm is. But I do think that there are aspects of Hungarian politics and policy that reflect what could be called illiberal or non-liberal. And in the first instance, it's a willingness to use, I think like all European nations, it's a willingness to use the power of the government and the state to restrain aspects of the market, to restrain some of the cruelest aspects of the market, to make sure that there's care is being taken of citizens who may not be as able or willing or whatever the reason is to succeed in the economic world, or to recognize there are spheres and domains of life where the market is not going to function very well, like in schooling, for example, or or you need some mixture, as in medicine. This might seem obvious. I think it would be uncontroversial with most American progressives to say this is one way you can be illiberal. Now, they wouldn't want to call it this, but this is really true. Like, to be really liberal in economics is to have a pretty free marketplace and to allow the market logic to operate almost everywhere. Ayn Rand, who's the most extreme liberal economic figure that ever existed, said that we should have competition in roads. So we should build, anyone who thinks they can have a better road should be able to build a road so that you can pick which road you want to drive on to go to Bucharest. Imagine a world in which you had 100 different competitors who all make a road going to the same place, and you charge different rates depending on how many potholes or cracks or how fast you can drive. Just the absolute insanity of this idea is remarkable. But this is the extreme version of what a liberal would see, what a kind of Ayn Randian fanatic who thinks you should just have the market everywhere would think. I think in the United States in particular, the part of Orban's regime that is the most controversial is his support for, especially for family policy, spending significant, I think 6% I read, 6% of the GDP to support family formation, support families that want to have children. So and as well as his willingness to say that there should be borders that are, keep certain people out unless they are allowed to come in and become members of our community. And that there's something about what it is to be a Hungarian that's distinctive. And we want to protect this in some ways, that a culture and a civilization isn't just permeable and isn't just something that you can just change by a complete different composition of peoples with different traditions, different religions, different histories, and so forth. Now this, of course, is what offends the West. And the more traditional idea about men and women and marriage, this is what offends the West. So it's not the illiberal economics that offends the West, generally, or the elites in the West. It's the illiberal social policy that offends the West. And yet, I think, as I suggested, at least intimated in my response to the suggestion about Sweden, it seems to me very likely the case that the societies that are most capable of being illiberal in economics are likely societies that have high degrees of solidarity and high degrees of sort of functioning social institutions, including family and the social networks, that are most likely to be able to sustain that less liberal economics over a long period of time. So I think from what I understand and what I know, I think one of the main reasons that many of the elites in the West are so fanatically critical of Viktor Orban is he presents the possibility that there's an alternative and that it works. That's what they fear. Now, I can't tell you that it's working because I don't live here and I don't know, I don't see it up close. But I can tell you the psychology of the Western elites is that they fear that it could offer an alternative. And this is really genuinely terrifying.
Okay, unfortunately, this was our last question. I see interested faces, and I see that no one's asleep. So I think this is the moment where we should stop and hope you enjoyed this conversation. And if you are interested, you should read Patrick's books, because I've read it in the last 2 weeks, and it was really interesting. And I hope that this conversation, debate, name it as you wish, was ultra interesting. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.